What if I told you that the biggest thing in therapy isn't the therapist itself, regarding outcomes? It's whether you walk into the room as a man or a woman. You will never trust therapy the same way after watching this video. And not because of anything that I'm going to tell you, but because of what the American Psychological Association tells its psychologists. I've spent the last several days reading and analyzing the APA's own practice guidelines for psychologists. And what I found completely changed the way that I think about therapy. And I've done a lot of reporting on this topic. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to show you the APA's official practice guidelines for psychologists working with men and with women. I'll compare them side by side using the original documents and look at 10 of the biggest differences that I found. How psychologists are taught to think before therapy even begins. I grouped these, as you can see. Also, how those differences can shape the therapy itself, and what those recommendations mean surrounding men's mental health. But before we do that, we need to understand two very important guidelines, as I mentioned. These are two official APA practice guides for psychologists. One focused on girls and women, the other focused on boys and men. Now, each one tells psychologists what to do, what to pay attention to, and similar things when they work with clients, including understanding those people's distress, interpretations of behaviors, setting treatment goals, other considerations like relationships, trauma, culture, and you get the idea. Now, to be clear, these are very similar documents, right? They're basically the same thing with guidelines, just happens to be one's written for practicing with men, the other one with women as clients. Also keep in mind here, now these are not mandatory steps to follow for therapists and clinicians, but rather it's meant to shape their clinical assessments. And when we place them side by side, like we will here, then the difference in emphasis becomes very difficult to ignore. I've also put these in my evidence library on my author site online, as I'll show right here, and that link will be below if you want to download copies for yourself. So, as I mentioned, I've grouped 10 specific category examples within the guides that we'll discuss in 3 overarching groups, shown here, to hopefully make it easier to follow along. Let's start with group 1, and this is the topic along the lines of before therapy. So the first one I want to show right here, by the way, I'll put them all up on the screen. I realize that the text may be a little bit small. That's more just for the confirmation, and the evidence is actually there than being able to read it on screen. Again, grab a copy and download it yourself. They are fascinating reads. So, okay, this first group, before therapy. This one right here, the overall focus is external context versus masculinity. For this one, in the women's guideline, we see that psychologists should begin by understanding the life experiences that they have and the circumstances that place women at risk. Where in the men's guideline, psychologists should begin by understanding how men experience and express masculinity. The women's document opens by asking psychologists to pay attention to the experiences and circumstances that may place women at risk, as I mentioned. Meanwhile, the men's document opens by asking psychologists to examine how men experience and perform masculinity. So right from the beginning, the therapist is being pointed in 2 different directions. Toward what has happened around the woman and toward how masculinity is being expressed by men. And the second one I want to cover in this group is actually the very first guideline that's in both of the documents. And this is cultivating strengths versus examining masculinity. In the women's guide, what we find is psychologists should recognize, honor, and build on girls' and women's strengths and their resilience. Meanwhile, in the men's guide, again, keep in mind, this is the very first guideline that's in both of the manuals. Comparatively, for the men, psychologists should understand that masculinity is shaped by social, cultural, and contextual influences. So the first instruction for working with women is to recognize and cultivate their strengths and their resilience. While the first instruction for working with men is to understand how masculinity was socially constructed. And that's a remarkable difference in starting point. The third one here is social framing. It's central to women paired with males' privilege. In the women's guideline, what we find is that psychologists should understand how structural discrimination and legacies of oppression continue to affect girls and women. Meanwhile, in the men's guide, psychologists should understand how power, privilege, and sexism influence boys and men in their relationships with others. Both documents discuss social systems, but notice where they place the client. The Women's Guide directs the therapist toward discrimination and oppression affecting women. The Men's Guide directs the therapist toward power, privilege, sexism that they are expressing, and the effect that those forces have on other people. One client is internally framed through what society has done to her. The other is partly framed through the power that he has to carry around and how it affects other people. And the fourth and final one in this category is the perceived resistance, specifically potentially healthy versus potentially restrictive. So, for example, here in the Women's Guide, psychologists should recognize that what appears to be resistance may actually sometimes just be a healthy response to oppression. Meanwhile, comparatively in the Men's Guide, psychologists should recognize that rigid or restrictive gender roles can contribute to psychological and interpersonal problems. Now, these passages are not defined exactly the same thing. Let me make that clear. I want to be careful and not pretend that they are perfect opposites. But the difference is still very important in how they frame this. The Women's Guide explicitly warns that what looks like resistance may actually be a healthy response to oppression. The Men's Guideline, on the other hand, introduces gender role conflict through language such as restriction, devaluation, and violation. In one case, resistance may be adaptive. In the other, adherence to male roles themselves may itself be part of the problem. Let's move on to group 2 here. So these are the ones that I found relative to things that might be done inside the therapy room. So for this one right here, therapeutic goals. Her empowerment versus your problems. In the Women's Guide, what we find is that psychologists should promote greater agency, critical awareness, and expanded choices for girls and women. But for the men, psychologists should reduce the problems that men and boys face in their acting out, including aggression, violence, substance abuse, and suicide. And look at the goals here. For women, the language is agency, critical consciousness, and expanded choices. For men, the language is reducing aggression, violence, substance use, and other problems that they face or that they act out. One side is framed around empowerment and expansion. The other is framed around risk reduction and behavior management. This next one here in this group, her trauma and your accountability. In the Women's Guide, what we see is psychologists should consider how women's experiences and life circumstances contribute to diagnosis and coping. But in the Men's Guide, psychologists should show empathy for men's traumatic pain while still holding them accountable for their behavior. Both documents recognize trauma. That's fair enough. But notice what happens when immediately afterward. In the Women's Guide, trauma and context help explain and diagnose her and her maladaptive coping. But in the Men's Guideline, empathy for traumatic pain is immediately paired with holding the man accountable for his behaviors. Her trauma helps explain what she does. His trauma is acknowledged, but the therapist is also reminded to not let him off the hook. Yeah, trauma? Okay, I get it. But still, you're responsible. This next one here in the same group has to deal with diagnoses. Women's distress is contextualized while yours is externalized. So in the Women's Guide, psychologists should diagnose girls and women only when necessary, using unbiased assessments, good luck with that, while also considering contextual and cultural factors. Comparatively, in the Men's Guide, psychologists should recognize that boys and men are more likely to express emotional distress through externalizing behaviors and diagnoses. The Women's Guide directly warns psychologists not to diagnose unnecessarily and tells them to preserve cultural and situational context. The men's introduction acknowledges that boys and men may be misdiagnosed, but it explains their distress through a tendency to externalize it. And my concern here is what that trains the therapist to notice first. Conduct problems, substance abuse, anger, aggression, or other visible behavior rather than the experience underneath it. And this next one, aggression including women's aggression is getting context while men's aggression is getting condemned. In the Women's Guide, what they tell us is that psychologists should understand that girls' relational aggression may develop as an attempt to gain power within constrained social roles. This is one of my favorites. I probably should have led with this one. Well, in the Men's Guide, psychologists should reduce aggression, violence, substance abuse, suicide, and other problems that boys and men behave and act out. The women's document explains relational aggression by discussing constrained access to power and the use of safer targets. The men's document groups aggression and violence among the problems that men act out, right? So one passage explains why the behavior developed, while the other presents the behavior as a problem to be fixed and reduced. Let's move on to this third and final group for here. This is what I found regarding things relative to beyond the therapy room, I'm calling it. So for this next one, family roles. Her burden versus your need to improve. In the Women's Guideline, what we see is that psychologists should recognize that women often carry a disproportionate share of family caregiving and responsibilities. None of this, by the way, you know this, I've talked about it before. When people do talk about shared family responsibilities and things like family roles and burdens, nobody's talking about who's cleaning the gutters, mowing the lawn, raking the leaves, fixing or replacing the deck. I just want to put that out there. It's more than just freaking washing dishes and making a pot pie once in a while. Anyway, back to this. In the Men's Guidelines, psychologists should encourage positive father involvement and healthy family relationships. And listen, when is the last time you saw any psychologist do anything effective or anything at all that promotes father involvement? No, what they're trying to do is remove dads from the homes, make women feel great about it, and then make dad feel guilty because he's not doing anything. That's an entire topic for different conversations. In fact, I just put one out yesterday. Have a look at that if you want. But listen, if we put these two passages together, the woman is framed as carrying too much of the family burden. Meanwhile, the man is framed as someone that psychologists may need to encourage toward positive father involvement. So even within family life, the default picture is she is overburdened and you need to step up. Now that may be sometimes true, of course, but it's still a gendered presumption that's definitely worth noticing. And this number 10, this final one right here, is about the broader systems. This is Women's Guidelines using stronger liberation language. So for the women, psychologists should work to change hostile environments and systemic discrimination that interfere with girls' and women's well-being. Comparatively, for the men, psychologists should work to address institutional, cultural, and systemic problems facing boys and men through advocacy, prevention, and education. Now, this final comparison is important because the documents are not complete opposites. Both ask psychologists to address institutional and systemic problems, but the language is still different. The Women's Guideline names hostile environments, global discrimination, and institutional oppression. But the Men's Guideline speaks more generally about just culture in general, institutions in general, and general problems that affect men and boys. Now, that's not a contradiction, but it is another difference in emphasis, terminology, and urgency. So let me just wrap this up with a little bit of discussion. These guidelines are not mandatory treatment protocols, as I mentioned, and the APA accredited programs are not explicitly required to assign or to teach these two documents in a word-for-word format. But that does not mean that they remain isolated policy papers with no practical influence. Oh, they are used. In fact, they're updated about every 10 years, I believe, as formal documents for the APA as professional guidance in therapy. As I mentioned, they are official APA practice guidelines built from the professional literature. Okay, so they are official APA practice guidelines that are built from the professional literature, while accreditation separately requires training in gender, diversity, cultural competence, and evidence-based practice. As a result, the ideas contained in these two documents can filter into, I'm sure very likely do, filter into graduate classrooms, assigned readings, supervision, even their practicum, and case conceptualizations, along with continuing education, even when no professor or whomever says we're following this guideline. It might not be that explicit. Oh, but believe me, it is part of the system. So by the time you enter her office, these assumptions may already be shaping what she's been trained to notice about you, including how your distress is interpreted, which questions to ask you first. It's a setup. She knows how she's going to handle you and what she's going to get you to do before you even make an appointment. This also includes the importance of her contextualizing your lived experience through a toxic masculinity framework. She's going to interpret your social context from her own perspective. That includes your behaviors, your masculinity, your accountability, and your entitlement. So if you still trust therapy exactly the same way after seeing these documents, that's your decision. But from this point forward, you'll never be able to say that you didn't know what psychologists are officially being taught. So listen, please, if this video did earn your respect, please subscribe, because there's a lot more original documents like these that I'd like to be dissecting before long. Have a great day out there, everybody. Be careful out there. I'll see you soon.